really strange experience, Kate, because I'm in the hot seat today, which is a real departure for me because I've always been the person to interview other people on this podcast, and it feels slightly weird. I've actually changed position, so I'm literally in the hot seat, and it's really nice to have you here to talk to.
Oh, well, you know what? I'm delighted. I was really honoured that you'd asked me to do this because we have known each other for so long.
Yeah.
And I've seen you go through this whole transitioning sort of journey. And I'm just delighted to be here. I've got lots of questions, and I know that your listeners, I'm sure, are going to be so interested to hear how you've gone from, I would say, you know, a frazzled PR boss to someone that epitomises just calm and balance and just joy. So
gosh, that feels like a huge responsibility. So firstly, I want to say that just for listeners to know that we have known each other for such a long time, and in fact you used to work with me in this house, and I used to be your boss for quite a number of years. I was your boss, which seems so strange now because obviously we're sat here as, you know, as very much friends, but that wasn't how we started off. I was your boss, and initially when you came to work for me, it was such a tiny consultancy that we were based still here in this house. And this room was certainly not the therapy room, you know, that it is now where I coach clients. It was I think it was a playroom at that stage, and we were in this tiny little room just next door where we used to sit next to each other and do our PR stuff, and that just seems like 100 years ago now.
Yeah, it really
does. It wasn't that long ago. It was like 16,
17 years ago.
16, 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And I just want to, I think there's one thing before we get into the whole PR thing that when you said that I epitomise, you know, joy and calm, I kind of felt like, I felt like so distinctly uncomfortable with that, because I am certainly calmer than I was all those years ago, and certainly more joyful than I was all those years ago. But it was from a very, very low base because I was a wreck. But I kind of instinctively recoil when I think that maybe my followers perhaps sometimes put me on a pedestal and think that I am this paragon of calm and you know, just epitomise this life of wellness. I'm really uncomfortable with that because, of course, they see the edited highlights naturally. You know, I don't post when I'm emptying the dishwasher or sorting out the washing between whites and colours. You know, no one sees that. And I think sometimes it can look like, oh, here she is wild swimming, and here she is on her allotment, and it's all this charmed life that looks so perfect, and so like it could be, you know, in a magazine. And that kind of bothers me because, of course, I'm not doing those things all the time. Like, we go swimming together, don't we? So it is real. We do actually go swimming together, and it's one of the lovely things that I do with you, and that I've really enjoyed getting closer to you. I think since the beginning of lockdown, we've kind of got so much closer. But we only go like once a week or once every 10 days. This is not what I'm doing every day. And yet people, I think, gain the impression that this is what I'm doing all day, is just going from this lovely lake swim to my allotment to just doing yoga. And it's just like this constant floating around in the state of calm. And that's absolutely not the reality, and I would really hate anyone to think that, but I think people do tend to think that just because of the nature of social media. And I was chatting to a friend recently who'd come up from London. I hadn't seen her for many years, and she's actually a psychotherapist now. I used to work with her in PR back in the day, and she said, you know, I just look at what you post and I'm just in awe, you know, of this wonderful, you're always doing this or you're doing that. And I was like, I don't do that all the time. Of course I don't. You know, that's not real. That's just what I was doing maybe on a Monday morning and then a Friday afternoon. And then between that, there was just normal work like everyone else, and normal shopping and cooking and all the drudgery that comes with life. So I really feel that's important to kind of put all that into context.
Yeah, and I think your listeners and your followers will thank you for that. But these are conscious choices that you have made over the years. These are things that you have prioritised, you've changed your boundaries, and that's been gradual change over 20 odd years. And I know that 20 years ago, you're not the same Susie as you are now.
Thank God.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank God. I don't even know if I'd be here if I was still that same person, because it was exactly 20 years ago that I was having my worst year ever. So this was before I knew you, before we started working together. And I'd left a very comfortable job where I'd worked for 8 years in a really nice agency. I mean, yes, there were always niggles with your bosses and there were bad days, of course, but it was a really family-like atmosphere and it was a nice place to work, you know, despite all the, you know, a bit of nonsense, whatever. But then what happened was I was working 3 days a week because I'd already had Max, my eldest son, and then I got pregnant with Louis. And I think they kind of took a bit scared because I was the first person to be pregnant in an office full of women, of young women. And I think they kind of realised that they were setting a precedent. So they basically changed the terms of my working so that it was 3.5 days. And that may seem like a tiny increment, but for me, that meant I only had 1 day with my kids basically, because the half day, by the time I kind of got home and everything. So it meant that I had to leave because I didn't want to I wanted the 2 days at home with the kids. The kids, I'm so tiny. Louis wasn't, you know, he was baby. And I ended up going to work for another agency quite far away, so it was a very stressful commute, which I'd actually got away from. I mean, I actually was able to walk to the office where I'd left, so it was this crazy move that I made to a very, very stressful commute in Manchester city centre. And it was honestly the toughest year of my life because it was a really hard environment. I can only describe it as a toxic working environment, and I was not used to that. I thought, because I was going to work for a woman who had young children, I kind of thought in my head that would mean she'd be kind of more flexible and empathetic. And actually, it was the reverse. And what happened was I tried and tried and tried to make it work. But no matter how hard I tried, it just wasn't possible because there wasn't the setup there wasn't the support to work part-time. So I ended up doing more and more and more and more just to try to keep things running properly for the clients, because as you know, I'm an absolute perfectionist at work and ultra professional, and you know that, like, everything done perfectly and on time, and that's just how I've always been. And I was in this awful position where I couldn't make that happen because there just wasn't the setup. And I remember on my first day, there was a guy who just got back from 6 weeks. He'd been signed off for stress, and I know this sounds bizarre now, but I'd never heard of someone going off work for stress at that point. And I remember not knowing what to do with my face when he told me that he had been off work for 6 weeks with stress. I wanted to look empathetic, but I was like, what? You know, we work in PR. It's not like we're firefighters. Like, how could you possibly justify being off work? Because I'd always had stressful days at work, and we'd had days where we'd had the good cry and we'd had a good whinge, but we'd always come in the next day and just carry on. It was never entered our heads to actually not come to work because it was a stressful time, or my boss had said something horrible to me again, or whatever. And but it then became apparent that I was working somewhere where there was just no, there were a lot of things really very, very wrong. And I felt like I was almost hanging up my values, everything I believed in, when I walked through the door. It was like I had to leave it on a coat peg. Because there were things that went on there. There was bullying. I'd never seen that before. I'd never seen out and out screaming bullying before. Actually, not by the boss, but by one of the older employees to one of the younger employees. I'd never seen that before. There was just lots of things which were really, really unpleasant. And I am very careful not to make any mention of who the agency was, because you know what, I think that things change, and probably it's not the same place now. It's probably a very nice place to work, but at that time it was pretty hellish, really.
Wow, so this happened 20 years ago, and I can see now, just from talking to you, the impact of that has really stayed with you.
It has. I mean, I kind of soldiered on, because for me, you know, I'm not a quitter, and I had a job to do, and I was a senior person there. I was an account director, but it was impossible, because Louis was 8 months old, Max was 3. And the way it was set up was that I would have this half a day where I could be called at any point to speak to a client or to come into a meeting. And what that meant was I couldn't relax for a second when I was at home, or when I was at a mummy and me thing. And I remember finally getting to a mummy and me thing. It probably would have been with Louis, you know, who was just a baby then. And I was like, oh, I made it. You know, I'm at mummy and me. And I thought I was having a really nice time. And then this girl said to me, a girl I didn't even know that well, she said to me, Susie, I've never seen you looking so unhappy. And it absolutely hit me, you know, like in the solar plexus, because I thought I was at mummy and me, and, you know, I'd finally got something nice in the week. But I think the tension must have showed on my face, because I knew at any point my phone could ring, any point, and I would have to speak to a client. You know, that was the way it was. A client would just be put through to me at any point. So I remember once I was at home on, you know, supposedly one of my days off, but there wasn't really ever a day off, because I was on call, in effect. And I had to speak to a client, and Max was in this room. This room was a playroom at that point. Gorgeous, sweet little boy. I mean, he was just the sweetest kid. They were both the most adorable little boys. And he wanted to show me a picture. He'd done a picture. And I had to speak to this client. And I couldn't say to this client, I'm so sorry, I'm with a 3-year-old. Can I just call you back in an hour? I couldn't say that, because it was all this front that, you know, I don't think they even knew I had children. You know, it was all, I had to put on this kind of professional front. And so instead, I locked the door. I locked that door that's behind you, because it was the only thing I could think to do to keep him quiet so I could speak to this client. And I could see him like trying to open the door, and he started screaming. You know, he was crying, and I felt sick. I literally felt physically sick. You know, like, what kind of mother does that? Locks this little child in the room when he just wanted to show me a picture. You know, when I eventually let him out, it was just a picture that he wanted to show his mummy. And that's why now I think when sometimes I post stuff about what I'm doing with the kids, and people will put in the comments, oh, you're such a wonderful mummy and your kids are so lucky. And I just kind of feel like, you know, don't think that. Don't think that for a second, because, you know, for all those years, I would not have won Mummy of the Year award. You know, far from it. I was a screaming, frazzled, you know, overwhelmed mother. I was constantly late to pick them up from nursery, because I was always trying to just get one more thing done. And I would be the person who was like replying to an email, and my bum would be in the air, because I was fooling myself that I'd gone out the door. But I hadn't. I was still in the office replying to an email. And I knew the time was bobbing on, but I wanted to get that last email done. And then it would be rush, rush, rush. I'd be stuck in traffic for an hour, literally getting more and more stressed, because I knew I was going to be late again. And I'd be fined at nursery, but it wasn't even that. It was like that I was late for my kids. And I remember just rocking up one day, again late, and everyone had left the nursery, and there was this very hacked off looking nursery nurse just there outside, and it was a cold day, and she was all wrapped up, and my 2 little boys were just wrapped up, just waiting outside the door. And I just drove up, and I just thought, you know, I'm just like the worst mother in the world. And Maxie said, Mummy, just go through the traffic. So that was like the daily thing. But then it would get worse when one of the kids was ill, and that would happen frequently. So you've got 4 kids, and
listen, what the picture that you're painting here is, I think so many people can resonate with, of this like nervous system just constantly
Yeah.
just on like the highest alert, and you are trying to do everything, and clearly trying to, you know, you're ambitious and you want to be professional, and you, like you say, you're a perfectionist at work, but something ultimately has to give. And from
Yeah.
what it sounds like, it was your health.
It was my health, yeah, because the thing was, you never knew when you woke up in the morning if the kids were going to be well enough to go to nursery. So you were constantly in a state of fear, constantly. And this was, you know, my boss was not really that sympathetic to the kids being, and I just wanted to get to work, you know, to do my job. And then one of them would have a cold or, you know, like a gungy eye. And I look back now and I'm horrified to say that I remember I just like tart up their eye. You just like kind of clean it up, Calpol, you know, just dose them with Calpol and just drop them at nursery when they shouldn't have been at nursery. You know, and I know they shouldn't have been at nursery, but I was so desperate to get to my desk. I wasn't letting anyone down. I was literally just hurling them through the door. And I remember once that they wouldn't take them at nursery. I think one of them must have had like an ongoing eye infection or something. And I would then just drop them at my mum's. And my mum had just had a back operation. You know, my parents were already elderly. You know, they're kind of just already elderly. And I drove up, just literally hurled them out there was no kind of like kisses and hugs, just so I could race on to Manchester City Centre and get to work. You know, mum and dad were in no state to look after them, but it was like you have so few options in that instance. And so it just got increasingly fraught. I was trying to keep up this very professional demeanour, and I remember once going to a meeting with, it was actually a group of lawyers, and I'd cut my finger in the morning because I was in such a rush. You know, I was always in such a rush, like trying to get breakfast ready. I cut my finger. And the only plaster I had was a Teletubbies plaster. So Teletubbies, if you're not familiar with, it was a very big kind of children's TV programme at that time. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I can wear this plaster because this shows that I'm a mummy, you know, and I'm going to see these very professional, you know, group of 10 male lawyers, and how can I sit there with this plaster? But I didn't have anything else, so I went. And actually one of the lawyers was very sweet. He waited till the end of the meeting and he said, you know what, it's really sweet that you're wearing that plaster and it makes you more human. So, and I just wanted to hug him because I felt like, oh gosh, thank God it's okay that I've worn this plaster. But that was the level of paranoia that I would not come across as professional.
Yeah, I mean, the era that you're talking about, you know, it was 20 years ago. So even though then we kind of thought, oh, women, you know, working mums, it was normal. But actually what you're describing here is you're trying to do it both. You're trying to do it all and trying not to let anything slip. And it's just not possible.
It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible.
You know, hearing you talk about that is making my stomach churn, and it's giving me palpitations because I can understand and I can see. And I remember almost, you know, you were much better when we were working together, but there still was that element. There was a huge amount of rushing and making sure everything was right, and lots of time spent and making sure that we were on time, you know, on call for clients. And now I kind of think, you know, now that you're older and you look back at that Susie, is there anything that you would, you know, is there anything you would say to her now if you could give her one piece of advice?
Yeah.
When you see yourself in that, the biggest, most darkest day, I say the darkest days and the hardest times, now you've come out the other side, you still remember it, I can sort of see there's still that level of trauma in your body when you talk about it. What advice would you give her now?
I mean, if she walked through that door now, I mean, I would just, like, now I would look at this woman and know that she's trying to do something that is not possible. But I think I didn't know that because nobody told me that. There was nobody that said to me, you know, I needed a health coach. Yeah. But firstly, there weren't health coaches at that time. And I didn't know I needed a health coach. I didn't even understand that all the symptoms that I was getting, never mind the kids, because I started to get ill as well. And it started to come to a head. So this was literally exactly 20 years ago, because one of the things that happened during my time at that place was 9/11. And I saw those towers coming down, and I now can look back and see perfectly clearly that I got PTSD. Now, that would have seemed ridiculous if someone would have told me that at the time. I thought, well, I wasn't there. I didn't even know anyone who was in the towers, so how could I possibly be suffering any sort of trauma? And it was only years later when I learned about, many more people got PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from watching coverage of the Boston bombings than were at the Boston bombings. But what happened was I just went into the state of total shock and grief. I mean, absolute intense grief at what I had seen. I couldn't believe that I had seen the death of these thousands, literally with those coming down. And I just, for about 3 weeks, I didn't read anything else or watch anything. I just was reading constantly about the testimonies and everything. I was in this awful state, but didn't really recognize it because I wasn't there. And I remember I had to go to a meeting. So this was one of these last minute meetings that I was called to at any point the next day, which was a Wednesday. And it was at a hotel with my boss and a client. These women were as hard as nails, my female clients and my boss. They really were. And there was a TV on behind. So I was seeing, out of the corner of my eye, I was seeing that obviously the news was on a reel. And I was like, oh gosh, can you believe it? And this woman just went, oh yeah, it's like in a movie, isn't it? And then straight on to, right, okay, there was nothing. And then straight onto the agenda. And I desperately wanted to talk about it and kind of process it. And yet I was being asked to kind of just dismiss it as like, oh, like a movie, and let's just crack on. And I got a call from my boss later that day saying that the client had complained to her that I was on another planet. And she was right. I was on another planet because I was in shock. And I wasn't myself in that meeting, and I wasn't my usual on it professional Susie, because my head was looking at the coverage behind her head.
Wow. And you were just showing genuine empathy and sadness and just recognizing that this was a horrific event. And I think, back then, maybe were you almost kind of berating yourself for showing emotion in a professional...
Well, you couldn't. You couldn't show any emotion, but yet I'm not great with a stiff upper lip. I'm not very good at hiding emotions. Like if I'm upset, I look upset. And I just couldn't put on a front. It wasn't in me. I was in such deep shock. Don't forget, this was the morning after. This was like 10 o'clock the next morning. As much as I wanted to be present and in the meeting, I just wasn't. I needed to go and talk to someone, probably, to try and process it all. So I was struggling with this, and then basically everything came to a head. I think in around the February, I was about to go to a meeting with a big group of men. I was working in a sector that was full of very tough people. It was a very, very tough sector I hadn't worked in before, and there was a lot of misogyny. It wasn't a pleasant sector to work in. I'm not saying everyone in it was nasty, but it was not what I was used to. And I was about to leave to go to the meeting. I got a call from nursery saying, you need to come and pick Louis up. He's had a diarrhea nappy, and their policy was, if that was the case, they needed to be picked up in case it was, something that was contagious. So I said, gosh, look, I'm going to a meeting now. I'll come straight after. And she said, no, you need to come right now. And I said, I can't, you need to come now. And I didn't know what to do, but I I had to go and get him. So I said there were two other people going to the meeting, my boss and my account exec. So I just said to them, I'm so sorry, I've got this emergency call, I'm going to have to go to nursery. So I rushed out feeling horrendous, letting everyone down. Louis needed me. And then I hadn't even got to my car. I got a phone call from my office manager saying, you need to come back. Your boss says you need to come back and go to the meeting. So I turned around and came back. Very, very fortunately, my husband, who generally was away, at that point he was in a job where he travelled like 80% of the time. So he just wasn't, I couldn't rely on him to do any of the nursery drop-offs or anything like that. He just was travelling too much. And I just called him in desperation, and he was in Manchester that day. Because I didn't have anyone else. There was literally nobody else who could pick Louis up. Nobody. My parents lived not too near, they didn't have a car seat, there was no one. And thank God he was in Manchester and he was able to go and pick Louis up. So I got back to the office, my boss was there, and in front of the whole office, she said, I'm running an agency of effing part-timers. She said to me, she didn't say effing, she said the word in full. And that was really, really brutal to hear, because I worked so hard. Like, I was the person that took my in-tray home, my entire in-tray home. Literally, I could barely carry it to go through it the weekend because there was no time to do it in the office. And I would spend the entire weekend going through my in-tray just in my own time. I was so diligent. I was such a hard worker, as you know, having worked with me. And to be called an effing part-timer was really, really hard. And so I went to the meeting and I drove with my account exec and I cried the whole way. It was about a 20-minute journey. And I was wearing mascara, of course, because, in PR, you have to wear mascara. And I was always told, wear mascara, wear earrings, you have to look the part. And I just looked horrendous because I didn't have any eye makeup remover. And I walked to this meeting just with like these panda eyes, white as a sheet, and in this awful state because something in me was just dead, because I had been prevented from going to pick up my baby who needed me. And I got through the meeting. I just probably just sat there. I don't think I could have put on a front and looked really perky and engaged. I don't know what they thought of me because I probably looked really shocking. And that was, I think, a turning point where I realised that I couldn't really do it anymore. And I think shortly after that, I said, I actually resigned. Well, I handed in my notice and my boss persuaded me to stay. And because I'm someone who doesn't want to let people down, and I knew that she needed me, and the clients needed me, and I didn't want to let anyone down, and I allowed myself to be persuaded to stay, but nothing changed. So there was no kind of, don't worry, we'll take this off you or we'll get more support. Nothing changed. So I think what we agreed was that I would only work 3 days, but the work didn't change. So I was just effectively paid less, but was still doing exactly the same amount of work. And the really weird thing was that the next day I started with this red eye in one eye. I think it was my right eye, like an eye infection. It was bright red. And I went to the chemist, I got eye drops, and it didn't shift. And went to the doctor, got a prescription. Nothing shifted this red eye, and it looked horrendous. And we're supposed to look good, in PR, and I couldn't do anything with it. I had like touche éclat for under the eye because obviously I looked knackered the whole time, and my Benefit blusher and all of this, and my trouser suit and briefcase. But then I had this horrendous red eye. I looked like alien-like, and I could not get rid of it. And it went on for week after week after week. And I'd almost sometimes I'd bump into a client in the street in Manchester, and I would almost hide myself because I knew I looked so awful. I just couldn't get rid of it. And then 3 months after I first resigned, I was having a conversation with your sister-in-law, Jude. It's a very, very, very dear friend of mine. And we were sitting in the garden and I was complaining about the job, about the stress and everything. And she said, Susie, I want you to know that I will always listen to you. But I also want you to know that you said this a month ago and a month before that and a month before that. And that really hit me, because I realised that, you know, when it was tolerable, I would just carry on, and then there were bits where it would go like intolerable, but then it would go tolerable again. And I realised at that point it wasn't going to get better. So that kind of lodged itself in my brain, and I'm really grateful for her honesty with that. And then what was happening is, alongside the red eye, I got all other loads of symptoms. So I was losing weight. I mean, drastically losing weight. I always ate like a horse, and I was eating like a horse, just like I normally did. But I was losing weight, and I hated it because, you know, I'd look in the mirror, I could see my ribs. And it was just awful, and I couldn't. It's very frightening to lose weight when you don't want to lose weight. It's a very frightening thing. And I never once associated it with the stress. I just didn't. I was just like, well, this is so strange. I'm losing weight. And I thought, well, I'll just, you know, in addition to my big baguette that I get from Pret, maybe I need more calories. Like, I knew so little about nutrition that I thought, oh, I must need more calories. So I'll get a brownie, a chocolate brownie. So I'd started adding that to my lunch. You know, so then you've got inflammatory sugar on top of all the inflammatory stress hormones, you know, so that was not a great thing to do. But however many brownies I ate, I couldn't put on any weight. I remember one of these, there was an older lady who worked in the company, and she said to me one day, how are you managing it? I said, how am I managing what? She said, to lose the weight. I said, are you serious? Do you think I actually want to lose weight? I said, I was a size 10. I was slim. Why on earth would I want to lose weight? Do you think this is deliberate? And yeah, she wanted to know how I was doing it. Because you know what it's like in an office of women. Everyone's having like a cup of soup and starving themselves because it's all about being skinny. But I was trying to put on weight, and it was the stress. So I had the red eye, I had the weight loss, I came out in hives one day. You know, I had a facial because I thought, well, that would make me feel better. Came out in enormous hives over my face, so then couldn't go to work again. It was just one thing after another. I remember one day coming into work, and I had like this sort of hunchback thing going on. And my boss actually said, you know, like, what next? Because it was every day I was going in with someone. And now I look back and I understand that my body was just throwing everything at me. I mean, it was so intelligent what it was doing. It was saying, you don't belong here. You need to leave. This is hurting you. This job is hurting you. You need to leave. But I couldn't accept it. I wasn't listening. I didn't connect the dots between all these symptoms. And it's so ironic. I look back now because I worked in communications. I was an account director for a communications agency. My whole expertise was in communications. Plus I was a linguist. You know, I had a first-class degree from UCL in French and Spanish. And yet, you know, even though I could translate 19th century French poetry, I couldn't interpret what my own body was telling me. And it was making it so obvious. You know, it was throwing the book at me. It was screaming at me. And I couldn't understand what it was telling me. It was just like another irritating symptom. Oh, bloody hell, now I've got this. Let's put some more makeup on. You know, let me take some more night nurse. Let me take some more of this medication or that medication. But I didn't understand that it was all connected to the stress of the job, and that the only way it was going to get better was for me to actually leave this job. So eventually what happened was I went to my GP, because I just was worried that I couldn't put on any weight, and he sort of weighed me. I was under 8 stone, which for my height is very light. And he was very forthright, and I'm so grateful to him for that. And he said, if you carry on like this, your periods are going to stop. And that really shocked me, because that sounded really serious, you know, for my periods to stop. And that was the wake-up call that I needed. And so I actually went into work the next day and I resigned properly, for good. And I remember walking out and just feeling this huge sense of relief that it was going to come to an end in another 4 weeks, whatever. It was actually going to come to an end. The red eye went, like, within a couple of days, it had gone. And now I look back and think, it was a red alert. That's what it was. It was a red alert saying, leave the job, leave the job, leave the job. but I couldn't see it. I wasn't willing to see it. And I honestly think that's what my body was doing, was giving me a red alert. Yes, also, it's the inflammation, and, our bodies can get rid of a red eye in a minute. It's not a difficult thing for a healthy body to get rid of. But because I was so inflamed because of the toxic stress, my body couldn't fix itself. I understand that now. But at the time, it was just another annoyance, another thing that my body was letting me down on, because it was falling apart at the seams. Yeah. I was falling apart at the seams.
Wow. I mean, it's so powerful to listen to you talk about that, because exactly what you say, your body was screaming at you.
Yeah.
And, there must be so many people out there maybe listening right now who are thinking, I remember that, or I'm going through that now.
Yeah.
And we just dismiss because we've got to power through, and everything's got to be right, and everything's got to be perfect, and we've just got to just keep going. And, to me, it sounds like you were burnt out, you were physically and mentally exhausted, and you were desperately trying to be a mum that you wanted to be, but also fulfill the ambitions that you...
I wasn't even ambitious. I was never ambitious. It's just that I was contracted to do a job. And for me, if I'm contracted to do a job, I have to do it to the very best of my ability. And that's all there was to it. It wasn't that I had any great aspirations to be this, to get to the top of the tree. But that was my job title, and I had responsibilities to my clients, to my boss, to my account, exec and account manager, and I didn't want to let anyone down.
Okay. So tell me what happened after you left.
Right. So I finally left, and I remember for a couple of days after that, I remember being at the kitchen sink, like doing some washing up, and this really strange thing would happen in that I would go like have this sharp intake of breath, and it was exactly as if I'd been underwater for too long, and I come up for air. And it happened for a few days, and what I realised was I hadn't even been breathing for that entire year. Obviously, I've been breathing, but I hadn't been breathing fully. I'd been so braced every second for the next onslaught, for the next, attack or thing to go wrong, that I actually hadn't been breathing fully. And this was almost like my body recalibrating and taking these huge intakes of breath. And it took me a while to get over it. I remember it was about 6 weeks later, I was putting my jeans on one day, and it wasn't that I couldn't get them over my hips, I couldn't get them over my thighs. My thighs. That was how tiny these jeans were. I think they were a size 6. And I remember being so happy. Oh, which is the opposite of, normally women are like really distressed when they can't get their jeans. But I was so happy because I knew that meant I was getting better, that I was getting back to myself if I couldn't get these ridiculously tiny jeans on that no woman of 30 should be able to get in because they were like a child size. But I would still not be able to go to to Manchester city centre, to town. I would, particularly if I was on the road, I had to avoid that road. But if I had to drive down it, I remember like hyperventilating, and I'd never ever hyperventilated before. I was already 30, but I would go down that road, and I would literally, the panic would set back in, just by being on the road where my office was. And that went on for quite a few years. I used to try and avoid like going to city centre.
So it's really deep-rooted trauma that this, and I don't use that word lightly, because from what you described, it had such an impact on your nervous system, on your private life, on your health, on your emotional well-being, that, this is, was carried with you for a very long time, to the point where you have made very conscious and quite dramatic lifestyle changes. But tell me how, so 10 years ago, so that was 20 years ago.
That was 20 years ago. And at that point, I thought, I'm washed up. I'm finished in PR. No one's going to want to employ an account director on 3 days a week. I'm basically finished. I felt like a wrung out dishcloth. My confidence was on the floor. I hadn't managed to make it work. I failed. I had no job to go to. It wasn't like I'd left to go to another job. I knew that if I didn't leave, I was going to end up like in the Priory. So I just left. with nothing, no prospects, no job, nothing. Didn't know how I was going to pay my nursery fees. And then out of the blue, an old supplier from my first agency, where I was for 8 years, heard that I was leaving somehow. And he said, I'd never met him. He was the person I used to call when my computer didn't work. And he said, I would love you to do my PR. And that was my very first client as a freelancer. And then it just snowballed. With no design by me. I mean, I didn't have any ambition at that point. I just thought I was kind of finished. It snowballed to the point that I couldn't then handle it by myself. And that's where you came along. And then we employed someone else. And then there were 3 of us. And then I got pregnant with Ariella. And we had to move out of the house because I needed the room where I was working. Snowballed. And then it just turned into a big agency. Somehow, without any design, without any wish from my end, without any aspiration. I never wanted that. I really never wanted that, but it happened. So then it grew and grew and grew, and I found it really stressful to be a boss. I mean, the one good point was, and this was really important to me, was that after I left that horrendous year, I knew that I never, ever, ever wanted anyone to tell me that I couldn't go and pick up my child when they were ill. And that never happened again, because then I was the boss. And I do want to say that looking back, I totally see where she was coming from, my boss. I mean, I can look back and, after that, I had the shoe on the other foot, being a boss. And so I think, yes, she could have dealt with it more sensitively rather than swearing at me. But I understand it's not easy. It's not easy. PR is not a job that lends itself to that sort of flexibility. As you know, it's just not easy. So I don't judge her at all. And I certainly don't bear a grudge. But yeah, it very much coloured how I ran my agency, in that I always said, I don't want anyone ever to feel that they can't go and get their child, so I went the other way, like to the other extreme, and that brought its own problems. So I don't have all the answers. I'm not sitting here saying I have all the answers at all. But anyway, I ended up being the boss of this big agency. You were working there as well. And you could probably see that I was sort of going in 2 different directions.
Yeah.
Because I started with the Reiki and...
I mean, it started with the gorgeous smell, the aroma of peppermint throughout the office, and the treatment room at the top of the office, and you're right, the Reiki. I know that you were doing that at the time, and there was just lots of kind of hints that this was definitely your passion beyond a hobby. It was something that you really believed in, and it filtered out into the office, and it was lovely because we started having lots of sort of more health and well-being clients as well. And I mean, I personally loved it. I loved seeing this transition, and you definitely inspired me. I know that it was there within me, very sort of deep-rooted as well. So watching you do that made me realise, okay, it's okay to lean into that.
Yeah.
And then things became harder, I guess. Your dad got very poorly, and this was something that you, I guess, it was so important to you. Tell me a little bit about how your dad's illness sort of helped you transition even more into this more.
Yeah, sure. So this was in fact exactly 10 years ago. He had a very slow moving illness, which sort of cancer of the blood, which was very, very slow moving. And he was elderly, he was 90 at that stage. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm going to take Dad out for lunch this week. I'm going to take Dad out for lunch. I'd put it on my things to do list. And then what would happen was I would go into the office, and you know what it's like. It's very frenetic in a PR agency. I would go in and there'd be 10 people wanting to tell me about this problem or that problem with this client or that journalist, or wanting me to look at this or that press release. And then suddenly I was swamped. And then another day had gone, and another day, and then it was the end of the week, and like, oh shoot, I didn't take Dad out for lunch. I'll do it next week. And then exactly the same thing happened. And then one day he was having treatment, blood transfusions and so on. And I went over and I gave him some Reiki one evening. He was not in a great way. And he literally changed colour while I was giving him this Reiki. And he sort of looked up at me and said, I feel like an angel sort of touched me or something. He felt radically better. And I just thought, this is crazy. This is just crazy. And I made this very snap decision, overnight decision, that I was going to leave the business. Leave it. And I did. It was just before Christmas. It was exactly 10 years ago. And I just went in, I said, guys, I'm not coming back after Christmas. And this was just before Christmas. And they had, at that point, I was proofing everything. I checked everything, which was part of the reason it was so stressful. So it was a really big move to just walk away and leave everyone to kind of get on with it. But I just had this overwhelming feeling that I was done and I needed to go. And I knew that Dad didn't have very long. So I left. I did take him out for lunch. And what had happened was my Reiki master, who used to do Reiki a lot on Dad, and this is going to sound very strange to a lot of people, but she was clairvoyant, and occasionally she would get visions. Occasionally, she didn't do it all the time. She got a vision about Dad, and she knew that he was going to pass away in the March. And again, take that as you will. I know that will sound very odd to a lot of listeners, but I did believe it, and she was right. He did pass away in the March. So I did take him out for lunch. And yeah, he passed away a few weeks later. So what then happened is I got really stuck in grief, and it got worse. It got progressively worse over the months. So like 5 months on, I was like, there was no sign of me getting better. I couldn't be around people. I would just cry out of the blue if I saw anything at all, a restaurant or something that I associated with Dad. It was all very random, and people were like, they didn't know when I just burst into tears. It was all, and I'm not very good, as I said before, at putting on a stiff upper lip. I just don't have that in me. And eventually I went to see Ruthie Portnoy, who you've also done tapping with. She'd just learnt EFT. And she said, come over, I've just learnt this thing. She'd been a counsellor and, let's try it. So she did the tapping, the EFT with me. And I had 2 sessions, and it was so remarkable how I got back to being me. I was so blown away that I was back to being me, that I had my smile back, that I wanted to train up to help other people who are in a similar position. So that's when I trained up. And from then I found health coaching, and well, the rest is history.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak for hours about the power of EFT. It is, and until you see it, until you experience it yourself, but also when you see it with your clients and you see people that you're helping.
Oh yeah.
It's the release. And maybe it's just the fact that we hold on to so much, and there's just so many layers. And then like yourself, you experienced a huge amount of grief that you had an opportunity just to like release. And then it makes space, doesn't it?
Yeah, it just shifted. It just went. And it's not that I didn't remember Dad. It wasn't like it's like, oh, let's forget about that and just crack on. But I was able to go about my normal daily business and actually walk into a room of people without, having to run to the loo crying, So it was absolutely transformational for me.
So Susie, from this conversation, you are 100% a human, a very vulnerable human that has given us a really incredible background of how you've got to the place that you are now, and guess how you're able to help your clients, because what you've described, although it sounds awful, it's not uncommon. And
it's not. No.
And it sounds ridiculous because it sounds traumatic, horrific, not like a life. It shouldn't be the way people live. And now you have people that come to you and they just literally don't know, I guess, where to turn, what's the next step, like where do I go from this feeling?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about now where your life is and how you model to people. And I know you said at the beginning of our conversation that you don't want people to think you live this sort of perfect life of swimming and harvesting and like being out in the garden and all of that, but you make these conscious choices because it helps you feel calmer and more balanced, and it helps you be a better mum and a wife, friend, all of that.
Yeah.
And now you model this to others.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's okay to have the ebbs and flows, isn't it?
Of course.
To have a day where you are outside in the garden and having a lovely time, and the next day you've had a bit of a rubbish day.
Exactly, because that's just normal.
Exactly. Yeah. So tell me, what would you like to say to people listening now who are on this sort of precipice of wanting to change their life, but just feel that this next is just so far, like how, like what the next steps?
I think a lot of it is firstly acknowledging, looking at where you are. Because I think, I mean, for me, I was clearly in such denial about what was going on because I didn't want to accept the fact that I couldn't do this job. And sometimes I remember coaching a lady who was absolutely, you know, power suit, power hairdo, power jewelry, power makeup. And she was the head of this very, very big successful company. And I was on a Zoom call with her, and she was in her office, and she'd closed the door, and behind that door there was like 100 people who all wanted a piece of her. And she said, Susie, I can't breathe. And it wasn't a physical thing. I mean, I could see she was breathing, but it was a metaphorical. She felt suffocated by the weight of that expectation and that pressure on her. And I literally just breathed with her for that 50 minutes, but I totally got it. Like I totally knew how she felt, that she just couldn't, you know, and she'd put on all the, you know, the outward, I'm professional with the nails and everything, but she was inside, she was just crumbling. And I think often it's just actually recognizing, you know what, there's something that needs to change because I can't go on like this. And I think that can be the hardest bit if you're very aligned with your job, if your whole identity is caught up with your job or whatever it is that you do, whatever responsibility, to actually admit that you're, and I'm not saying that everyone needs to walk away from the job. I mean, I had to do it. But that's not an option for a lot of people. And it's not necessarily that that's what they need to do, but something needs to change. Something needs to change. And it's figuring out, you know, is this really what I want for my life and for my children? Because the knock-on effect for my kids, you know, it couldn't have been fun for them to be around such a fraught, overwhelmed mum. Yeah. It wasn't who I wanted to be. I wanted to be a really loving, caring, fun mum.
Yeah, and I think so many of us want that.
Yeah.
And now that your kids are older and more impressionable and they can see what you're doing, it's very powerful because as, you know, our kids getting older and they're moving into, you know, their own lives and jobs and careers, to know that it's okay to step back and to have balance and to recognise the importance of your health, that it's not, you know, at any cost. It is so important to have a bigger perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, what's more precious? And I was literally squandering my health. I mean, my health was disappearing in front of my eyes, although I couldn't really see that. And it was me doing it because I was insisting on staying in this job, which was destroying me. It really was. I don't think that's too dramatic a word to say. So I guess what I would model is, you know, put your health first, because without your health, you can't do anything. You can't be the mother you want to be, the professional you want to be. It all starts with your health. And now that I have put that first, I am a better mother. I'm absolutely a better mother because I've got the patience, I've got the resource. I'm much calmer. So whatever the kids come with, I'm not reacting, I'm not screaming because I put myself first. Yeah, that's how I can then have the headspace and the capacity for them.
Yeah, it's that, isn't it? It's the resource. You're creating an internal resource. That is more powerful than anything. Susie, this has been so interesting, fascinating, and I wish I had known you back 20 years ago because I would have given you a shake and said to you,
well,
stop.
I don't know if you would have done because I'm not sure because I mean, it's so funny, isn't it, Kate? Because when I think back to when we were working together in that office, and we were so busy doing all our PR-y stuff, and you know, if someone would have walked in however many years ago, 17 years ago, and with a crystal ball and said, right, you and you, Kate and Susie, you know, in 15 years time, you're going to both be like wellness coaches, health coaches, and you're going to both have a podcast. We would have just thought it was the most hilarious thing. Like, what the hell's a health coach? What's a podcast? Because we worked in PR, that was who we were. I never imagined that there could be a different future for myself. As far as I was concerned, that was my job. Yes, it was stressful. And I used to look at these lifestyle magazines with these women, you know, with 3 kids in their garden with some kind of like lovely home-based business making like soaps or something at home, and I would just like look at them so wistfully and think, wow, wouldn't that be amazing to have a life like that? But it was just in a magazine because my job was stressful and that was my lot. So I don't think either of us could imagine that we would have this, you know, these years later.
No, absolutely not. And I really do resonate with some of those feelings of that PR industry, because even though I was younger, I mean, thankfully I came to you when I was pregnant, you know, with my first child, who's now nearly, you know, 16 and a half. So I got you when you were, you know, wanting to be the boss that would, you know, be flexible, and I'm so grateful to you for that. But even before then, I left my first job in PR because I could feel that my nervous system couldn't cope with that. And maybe I'm, you know, listen, I'm very grateful that I was probably in tune with what was going on, because that overwhelm was there every day. And yeah, so it
was stressful. It sounds so crazy for people who don't work in PR, but actually I remember you forwarding me something maybe even a couple of years ago, and it listed the jobs that were most stressful, and PR was like right up there.
Yeah.
You know, and it just is very all-consuming, all-encompassing. There's no getaway, is there? Especially not now with social media. You just can't ever do enough for your clients. And I look back now and I smile at, you know, how I was in the office, you know, with the peppermint stuff. And because I had this group of people they were like my guinea pigs, you know, and they didn't want me to give them health advice. I wasn't qualified to give them health advice. And yet I would lecture them, you know, about, and, you know, I remember one guy, one of my very dramatic account directors, he used to have his bin full of sweet wrappers and crisp wrappers because he'd just eat them constantly. And I would literally go in his bin and hold it up and say, you can't eat all this crap, you know, that's not feeding your brain. How are you going to concentrate eating all of this? And get them fruit and nuts and try to talk to them about healthy eating. So I think all the time there was this health coach that I didn't even know was fighting to get out when I said, right, I want everyone out. We want to go outside for a brainstorm. Let's go out in nature. And, you know, that I was like hectoring them and giving them this advice that they didn't want. They hadn't signed up for that when they came to work for me. But I think it was this part of me was trying to come out. And it just didn't work. So I'd have the therapy room upstairs with my Reiki bed and my candles and whale music, doing Reiki on like friends or, you know, whoever needed it, who was going through a stressful time. And then I'd go back into a PR meeting, you know, with a client. And it was this ridiculous juxtaposition that just makes me laugh when I look back, because it was never going to work. You know, I couldn't be a PR boss and this kind of like very calm Zen Reiki master. I mean, it didn't work. And I think I had to choose one or the other. I had to jump, and I chose.
And now it's so innate to you. It's so
yeah.
I mean, you do it so well. It's so intuitive, and that is, it's an amazing lesson, because from what I'm listening is there must be people there with this brewing desire to, you know, whether it's creativity or exercise or anything, that they know that is so innate to them, but actually they're doing something completely different, and their body is probably trying to tell them that this is not you, or it's time to move on. But you know, like you said, you know, no one likes to fail, no one likes to quit, and we go, no, we're going to persevere, I'm going to just keep going because that's what I should be doing.
That's it.
But actually, if we just make a bit of space and just have a bit of time, then we recognise actually it's okay to move on. It's okay to evolve and flow and
But also, I think when you're good at something, and I was good at it, that's the thing. I had a good reputation. People wanted me to do their PR. They said, no, I want Susie to do it. And when there's that expectation on you, it's very hard to move away from that. And, you know, for years afterwards, people would come to me and say, I want you to do this PR. And I was like, I don't do that anymore. I've switched career. No, I want you to do it. And I'm like, I don't do that anymore. I'm sorry. So, and people found it very odd that I could give up what they said. How could you give it your baby? It was your agency. How could you walk away from it? And I was like, there was another baby. There was something else that I needed to do. I was done with that. I did a good job. It was finished. and there was something else I wanted to do with my life. But people found it odd because one minute I was promoting sweets, and the next minute I was giving a talk next to a doctor on how to prevent type 2 diabetes or how to reverse type 2 diabetes. And it was so confusing for people. It was like, hang on, weren't you just promoting sweets? And yeah, I was. And that's part of what gave me the knowledge to then flip to the other side and tell people how the food industry is manipulating them.
Well, I think you're going to be inspiring many on so many different levels. It's been fascinating. Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for allowing me to listen.
No, it's so lovely. We have such lovely chats anyway when we're swimming or walking or whatever in our yoga class that we both go to, and it's just been so lovely to actually talk to you being recorded. So yeah, I hope that people can maybe take something away from this.
I'm sure they will.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.